Okay, today we are going to look at the road to the Civil War. We ended last time with the Compromise of 1850, the last compromise that the nation is going to make on this issue of the spread of slavery in the Western United States. I urge you to go back and review the 5 points in the last lecture that were hashed out in that compromise. Now, again, I think many Americans, most Americans, I'm quite sure, would have hoped that the Compromise of 1850 would have settled things for a while, that they're not going to have to worry about this issue for a long time, if ever. But in 1854, conflict is going to arise over this issue of slavery in the territories once again. And this time, is going to be centered in Kansas and Nebraska territory, which if you look up at the smaller map at the top, in 1850, had been unorganized territory, kind of wild and woolly West with no formal governance, no governors, no legislatures. But in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois, proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act that would make Nebraska and Kansas into territories. And if you remember the Missouri Compromise from 1820, let's note that this territory was part of the Louisiana Purchase originally. So by the terms of the Missouri Compromise, right, everything north of this line, except Missouri, would eventually be free territory and free states. Everything south would be slave. So Nebraska and Kansas should have been free, right? There should have been no question that when these territories were organized, they would be organized as free territories and eventually free states. However, when Douglas proposed this legislation, he ignored the Missouri Compromise. And instead of recognizing that these territories should be free, again, in accordance with the principles of the Missouri Compromise, instead he offered in his legislation that Kansas and Nebraska, the question of slavery in those territories should be decided by popular sovereignty, by the people in those territories. That when those territories reached 5,000 population and they have their election for their territorial legislature, that they would elect a legislature that supported either freedom in the territory or slavery. Now again, this is a huge violation of the principles of the Missouri Compromise. No one had ever challenged the Missouri Compromise in such a way. And we have to wonder, why did Stephen Douglas propose that Kansas and Nebraska, that slavery in those territories be determined by popular sovereignty? Why didn't he just let the Missouri Compromise rule the day? Well, the fact of the matter is, Douglas has political issues, political concerns in mind. Douglas is trying to get a railroad to build a line from California, from San Francisco, out to Chicago here in his home state of Illinois. Now, of course, this is going to bring lots of jobs and trade and money and prosperity for Illinois. But there's a glitch, The railroad won't build through unorganized territory. The railroad will not lay tracks in any territory that does not yet have a government. And so it's really important to Douglas to get the Kansas and Nebraska through the Congress fast. And what better way to get it through fast than to get Southern support for the bill? Now, the South had already pretty much written off, they'd already written off Kansas, Nebraska, and that whole area off as free territory, you know, under the Missouri Compromise. But what better way can Douglas think of to get support from Southerners than to offer the chance, at least, that Kansas and Nebraska will allow slavery? And so, with Southern support for the bill, the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed in 1854, organizing Kansas and Nebraska territory under the provision of popular sovereignty. One result of this will be the founding of a new political party. In 1854, many Northern Democrats simply became frustrated with its own party, the party that was so willing, the part of the party, at least under Douglas, that was so willing to compromise with the South to the point of violating the Missouri Compromise. And so a new Republican Party is founded, a party that from the beginning committed itself to the idea of the containment of slavery. In other words, slavery, they said, should not be allowed to spread into any new Western territories and state. That included, in their minds, of course, Kansas and Nebraska. And so a lot of Northern Democrats will join this new party. A lot of abolitionists joined the party because even though the party doesn't come out for the abolition of slavery, at least it's committed to containing slavery, to not letting it grow. And the Whig Party essentially just merged itself in with this new Republican Party. So we've gone now from the Whigs and the Democrats as the primary two-party system to now the Republicans and the Democrats. The party structure that we have today. And we should note that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party today really bear no resemblance to their counterparts back in the 1850s. Yeah, but the names of the parties, of course, have remained. The containment of slavery. The containment of slavery. All right, so after Kansas and Nebraska is passed, what we're going to find is that the action is focused in Kansas territory. Because the Nebraska territory, which is today's Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, they don't have a lot of population, and they're not going to have a lot of population until after the Civil War is over. They're not even going to come close to having any kind of elections to determine whether slavery will or will not exist in that territory. It's Kansas. It's Kansas. It kind of becomes the battleground now on this issue of the growth of slavery after the Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854. All right, so Kansas then in 55, 56 is going to see a lot of people moving into this new territory. A lot of Southerners are going to come to Kansas, hoping that when it comes time for that territory to choose its legislature, there'll be a majority of pro-slavery people living in Kansas to influence the election and make Kansas a slave territory and slave state. We also see a lot of anti-slavery people moving into Kansas, many of them sponsored by Eastern anti-slavery organizations that will send enough people to Kansas, for example, to form a whole town like Lawrence, Kansas. Here, Lawrence was a very famous free state town. The entire town believed that Kansas must be free territory. Now, Now, when it comes time for their election for legislature, when they've reached 5,000 population, we can look back and know in hindsight that the majority of people living in Kansas were free state people. They did not want to allow slavery in Kansas. But we should also note that the outcome of their territorial legislature election didn't reflect that fact. When the votes were counted, the legislature that had been elected supported Kansas as a pro-slavery territory, a state that would allow slavery. Now, many Kansans couldn't quite understand how this had happened, and we should note that, that what had happened is that a lot of people from next door here in Missouri, if I can make my thing work here, here's Missouri, and Missouri is a slave state, you remember. But a lot of people from Missouri had crossed over into Kansas, and they'd voted. They voted illegally, and they had skewed the election results to elect a legislature that supported slavery in Kansas. Now, Kansans were outraged once they realized what had happened. Those border ruffians, they called them, from Missouri had messed with their election, and they demanded a second election. And in the second election for a territorial legislature, Kansas elected a legislature that was anti-slavery, that wanted to see Kansas in as a free state. Problem is, both legislatures considered themselves legitimate. Both legislatures met to pass laws and propose resolutions to bring Kansas into the Union, one free, the other slave. It may not surprise anybody to know that both sides on this issue in Kansas began to arm themselves, and violence will break out in Kansas. The violence begins in May of 1856. In May of 1856, a pro-slavery mob went into that free state town of Lawrence, Kansas, and sacked the town. They destroyed it. Sack is kind of a historical term for destroying a town. They burned buildings. They smashed the printing presses. They stole everything that wasn't nailed down. I mean, Lawrence was a mess, although amazingly there was only one death. But this pro-slavery mob had violently attacked a town of anti-slavery Kansans. 2 days later, the Northern abolitionist John Brown, who had come to Kansas with his sons to work for freedom in Kansas. And remember, John Brown believed that God had chosen him to end slavery in America. John Brown is going to take his sons up to a small settlement in the south of Kansas, probably not on this little map. He took his sons up to this little pro-slavery settlement called Pottawatomie Creek. And there, Brown and his sons killed 5 men in cold blood, just kind of picked out 5 guys and murdered them, and then chopped their bodies up into little bitty tiny pieces with swords and axes just to make their point. Potawatomi Creek Massacre is going to set off a guerrilla war in Kansas territory that will last about 6 months. Federal troops were eventually sent in to restore order in Kansas, but 200 Kansans had been killed and millions of dollars of property had been destroyed. Historians refer to this as Bleeding Kansas. Violence, bloody violence in Kansas. And in hindsight, it really is seen as kind of a dress rehearsal for the Civil War to come. I mean, the violence in Kansas had started over slavery in the territory. It was Kansan versus Kansan, brother versus brother. Just like the Civil War will be over slavery in the territories. American versus American. And quite literally at times, brother versus brother. And the violence in Kansas will spread to the floor of the United States Senate. One day after the sack of Lawrence, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a speech. Now, Sumner was a Republican. He's an abolitionist. He's from Massachusetts. He made a fiery speech in which he denounced the crime that had occurred in Lawrence. And during his speech, he referenced another member of Congress. He referenced a speech that had been made earlier by Representative Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Now, Butler supported slavery, and he had made a speech several days earlier that was extremely pro-slavery. Sumner tore down that speech from Butler, insulting Butler, calling him a lover of the whore slavery. Really did a number on him. And you know, I don't know what reaction Andrew Butler had to that speech from Charles Sumner, but another South Carolina representative, Preston Brooks, got really angry. Brooks is outraged at Sumner's speech. Charles Sumner, he says, has insulted the state of South Carolina, the citizens of South Carolina. He has condemned and insulted the core institution, the core economic institution of slavery in the South. And to make things just a little bit worse, we should note that that Preston Brooks is also Andrew Butler's nephew. So not only had Sumner insulted South Carolina and the institution of slavery, he'd also insulted Brooks's Uncle Andrew. And Brooks wants a measure of revenge. Brooks decided to confront Senator Sumner on the floor of the Senate the next day after the Senate had concluded its business. Now, Preston Brooks walked with a cane, we should note, a very fancy gold-plated cane. He walked into the Senate as it was adjourning for the day. He went up to Sumner's desk and he began to beat Charles Sumner with his cane. Blow after blow after blow, many of them at Sumner's head. Sumner trying desperately to hide under his desk. Eventually the other senators got their wits together and they pulled Brooks off of Sumner. But Sumner was badly damaged, was badly injured. He it's going to take about 3 years for him to recover from this. He had chronic pain for the rest of his life. And let's note that Massachusetts made the decision not to replace Sumner in the Senate while he recuperated. They decided to leave his seat empty so that every day Southerners would be reminded of the violence that Southerners would commit to defend the institution of slavery. Preston Brooks felt honor-bound to resign from the House. There'll be a special election in South Carolina to replace him. But damned if the people of his district did not re-elect Brooks back to his old seat. They approved of what he had done. People sent him new canes. One cane was inscribed with the words, "Hit him again." So we are seeing more and more division in the country now. More violence being carried out as this issue continues to escalate. And so the stage was set for the election of 1856. This is the first election in which the new Republican Party, organized just 2 years earlier, will nominate a candidate for the presidency. The Republicans nominated John C. Fremont from California, pretty well known for his explorations of the West, his mapping of the Western territories, and his role in California statehood. The Democratic Party nominated James Buchanan, a congressman from Pennsylvania. During the campaign, the Republicans campaigned again on their commitment to containing slavery where it existed and not letting it grow into new territories and states. And they constantly condemned the Kansas-Nebraska Act during the campaign as a violation of the Missouri Compromise that never should have been allowed to happen. The Democrats, on the other hand, endorsed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, said that it was a great thing, a good thing. And they argued that Congress should never be allowed to interfere with slavery in the states or territories. In fact, they tried to argue that they never had the right to do so to begin with. Ultimately, Buchanan will win the election, but the Republicans had come close. If the Republican Party had carried just 2 more states, they would have won that election, and that is pretty good for a brand new baby political party, just 2 years old, a party that supported the containment of slavery. And so it appeared that there were many Americans who were beginning to look seriously at this new party and its ideas and its commitment to containing slavery. And so the Buchanan administration will begin. Now in 1857, we're going to see the Supreme Court now getting involved in this issue. Let me introduce you to Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave who lived from Missouri. He had lived with his master mostly in Missouri throughout his life, but at one point they had moved to Iowa, free territory. Iowa was a free state just north of Missouri. And when Scott's master died, Scott decided to sue for his freedom. he's going to file a case in Missouri District Court, state known as a suit known as Scott versus Sanford, in which he argued that he was a free man from the moment he had first stepped foot into Iowa, free territory. He had remained with his master, but everything he had done since he'd first stepped foot into free territory was of his own free will, including returning to Missouri with his master. Now, in his master's will, Scott was to be given to his master's nephew, but Scott, in his case, ruled that he should be free. He wants the court to recognize his freedom. Again, arguing that from the moment he stepped foot into free territory, that he had been a free man. The court, he said, should recognize his freedom. Now, the Missouri District Court that first heard this case agreed with Dred Scott. The Missouri District Court ruled that, yes, he was free. Now, the nephew of Scott's former master is going to appeal the case to the Missouri Supreme Court. And the Missouri Supreme Court ruled against Scott, agreeing with the nephew that Scott was still a slave. And so Dred Scott appealed this case to the United States Supreme Court, who handed down their ruling in 1857. The Supreme Court of the United States issued an opinion that had a couple of really important implications for what was to come. First, the court ruled Dred Scott, they said, should never have gotten into a court. He had no right to sue anybody, the Supreme Court said, because blacks were not citizens of the United States. Now, the court did not say slaves were not citizens. The court said that blacks were not citizens, free or slave. This completely negated any idea of black citizenship in the United States. And then they went on to rule that Dred Scott was still a slave because they said the Missouri Compromise that had made Iowa free, that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. That Congress, the court ruled, did not ever have the power to decide where slavery would or would not be allowed. And so the Missouri Compromise is formally repealed, null and void. The Missouri Compromise had held the nation together for 35 years, and being the first compromise on this issue of slavery in the territories that had enabled the country to put off having to make those hard decisions about slavery. But there was no more putting it off. If Congress did not ever have the power to decide where slavery would be allowed, if the Missouri Compromise had violated the Constitution, then essentially slavery was now open pretty much throughout the country. Wherever Congress had deemed it to be forbidden, and we're talking here about all of the Northwest Territories, all of the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase, California and these new territories here of Washington and Oregon, that meant that slavery could be established in all of those states or territories. So very clearly, the nation is coming to a point where something is going to have to be decided. And it looks like the pro-slavery forces were winning. The next defining event occurs in 1859. And it's John Brown again. John Brown, the Northern abolitionist who believes that he has been chosen by God to end slavery. Same John Brown who had organized the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. The earlier picture was John Brown as a much younger man. This is John Brown as he was in 1859. In October of 1859, John Brown is going to organize a raid on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and put together a band of about 18 men, his sons, some slaves, some free black men. And they broke into the federal arsenal, place where the Army kept its guns all nice and safe and locked up, with the intent of arming a slave rebellion, with the intent of stealing enough guns to mount to arm slaves throughout the South and trying to create a mass rebellion. Now, Brown and his men will occupy the arsenal at Harper's Ferry for about 30 hours, but eventually federal troops will capture them and end the siege. And after a trial, John Brown is hanged. John Brown, I think, knew the raid would fail. What chance did he have, really, against the Army? But he also seemed to believe that just the possibility of such a massive slave rebellion might, at this point in time, spark a war that Brown believed would result in the emancipation of the slaves. Crazy, idealistic, I don't know, but he seemed to truly believe it. And so many in the North saw John Brown as a hero, a martyr for the cause of abolition, a man who had been willing to die, who had given his life for the cause of abolition. They wrote songs and poems about him. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, one poem said, but his soul goes marching on. His cause will live on. Southerners see John Brown, though, as just the tip of the iceberg of a big Northern conspiracy to take away their slaves. Everybody who did not believe, as Southerners did, in the legitimacy of slavery was to be suspect. An editorial published in an Atlanta newspaper stated the following, quote, "We regard every man in our midst an enemy to the South if he does not boldly declare that African slavery was a social, moral, and political blessing." In other words, if you're not with us, you're against us. And with this backdrop, we have a presidential election the following year. The election of 1860. The Democratic Party met first, and the Democratic Party fought during their conventions. The Southern Democrats want the party as a whole to adopt a position in their platform that unequivocally stated that the party supported slavery in the territories. He wanted the Democratic Party to wholeheartedly proclaim their support for the spread and the expansion of slavery. Northern Democrats refused to go along with that. And so Southern Democrats walked out of the convention. They held a separate convention to nominate a separate candidate. So the mainstream Democratic Party will nominate Senator Stephen Douglas as their nominee for the president. And the Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge from Kentucky. But the point is that the Democratic Party has split, right? Some Democrats, Northern Democrats, I guess, they're going to vote for Douglas. Southern Democrats are going to vote for Breckinridge, but they're all not going to vote for the same candidate, which leaves the other party in a much better position. And so when the Republicans met to nominate a candidate, the Republican Party nominated a Illinois attorney and former member of the House of Representatives, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln personally opposed slavery, had all of his life. But as the candidate of the Republican Party, he will strongly back the official party platform of containment. And in order to try to broaden the Republican Party's appeal, the party also will put into their platform positions that were favorable to business interests, to Western farmers, and to immigrants. And with that split Democratic Party, it will be a pretty easy win for Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln carried every northern state to win 180 electoral votes. He only needed 152 to win. He carried no southern states, but then again, he didn't need to. The bulk of the population of the United States was in the north, in the Northeast. And so Abraham Lincoln was elected to be the 16th President of the United States and would be inaugurated in March of 1861. But just 1 month after Lincoln's election, in December of 1860, 2 months before the inauguration, the South Carolina legislature voted to secede from the Union, to leave the Union. They argued that the nation had elected a man to be president who only represented the North, who only represented a part of the country, who had not won any support in the South, and a man who was against that Southern institution of slavery. They could no longer, they said, stay in such a union. By February of 1861, still a month before the inauguration, 6 other states had joined South Carolina to leave the Union, and ultimately 11 states, those states there in red, seceded to form what they called the Confederate States of America, with their capital here in Richmond, Virginia. The Union, the United States, has split in 2. Now let me just note real quick that not every slaveholding state left the Union. Missouri, was a slaveholding state. It stayed in the Union. Kentucky, the same. Maryland, Delaware, slaveholding states that stayed loyal to the Union. And West Virginia here didn't even exist. West Virginia was part of Virginia, which was a much larger place than it is today. But the West Virginia counties didn't want to secede. And so a new state was formed, West Virginia, out of those counties that refused to go with the others. I suppose the North could have just let the South go peacefully. Take your slavery. Damn you, take your slavery. We don't need you. Go. But instead, the North fought. They fought for 2 reasons. One, the North fought, the Union fought, for the principle of containment. Pretty much everything we've talked about in this lecture, every major issue and debate since 1850 had been centered on this issue of whether slavery should be allowed to spread into Western territories. The war initially is not about abolishing slavery. It was about containing slavery. And the North is willing to fight to uphold that principle. Now, of course, the war will become a war to end slavery. That will end slavery. But it was initially about containment. And second, the North is fighting to preserve the Union, to keep the United States united. Because, all the way back into colonial history, way back to the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Americans had seemed to believe that they could be an example for the world, a model. Massachusetts believed it would be a model for religion. But of course, at this point in time, by the 1860s, the Americans saw themselves as a model for self-governance, for the ideals of democracy, freedom. That if the Union could be broken like this, what kind of a model of self-governance could they be? In a sense, all that would have proved is that self-government didn't work, that their experiment had failed. The South was fighting for slavery, period. Every single one of those 11 states that left the Union, in the official documents that were passed in their legislatures to to formally secede, listed the preservation of slavery as a primary issue for their secession. Even today, Southerners try to say, oh, the Civil War was about states' rights. But the states' right that these Southern states seemed to care most about was their right to hold human property as slaves, human beings as property, as slaves. The Civil War was about slavery, pure and simple. The first shots in the Civil War were fired in April of 1861. In South Carolina, when Southern volunteers who were joining the Army of the South in large numbers attacked the Union Fort Sumter in South Carolina. It was a defeat for the Union. The fort fell to the South. But with that attack, Abraham Lincoln called for volunteers to the American Army. And the Civil War begins, April 1861. The Civil War will last for 4 long, bloody years. It will not end until April of 1865. And over those 4 years of fighting, the Civil War will claim almost as many American dead than have all the other wars the United States has ever fought put together. I mean, if you combine all of the dead, all of the American dead in the Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. If you combine all of the dead in all of those wars, it comes out to about 680,000. The Civil War, all by itself, in 4 years, claimed 620,000 American dead. 620,000 Americans dead, Northern and Southern. This is the bloodiest war in American history. The most Americans ever lost in one conflict. Next time, we'll examine the war. I don't do battle by battle. You guys know that by now, but we will talk about the advantages held by the two sides as the war begins. We will take a brief look at their general strategies. We will note the turning point in this war. And we will note, of course, that in the end, the Union will be preserved. The North will defeat the South, and slavery will be abolished.